The present lecture falls in a series of lectures titled History and Forms of the Lyric, and lyric is a term whose specifically Western salience is made painfully apparent in the confines of Jonathan Culler's recent theory of the lyric. It is true, due deference is paid routinely to Babylonian and Chinese traditions, as though these were securely located in a distant past, offering Western poets the opportunity for a little tasteful plunder. But only recently has an enterprise like the substantial Poems for the Millennium Volume 4 devoted to North African literature seemed feasible, if attracting far less attention than the preceding volumes. While Teresa Villa-Ignacio is talking today about the French and English language work of Cole Swenson, Suzanne Doppelt, and Pierre Alferi, the Maghreb and the Middle East have a continuing importance in her work. Her present turn towards an imagined post-Anthropocene poetics is anticipated explicitly in her writing about the Lebanese poet Etel-Adnan, and emerges from her compelling translation and commentary on the post-colonial writing of Morocco and beyond in the volume of poems and papers from the twin French language and Arabic language journals Souffles-Anfas. Writing about Adnan's prose poem, There in the Light and the Darkness of the Self and the Other, Villa-Ignacio concludes elegantly that by thus commemorating the future of the you and the I in the present tense, the poem dares the impossibility of community into its tense present. The idea that lyric can realize and make physically felt the horizon of a desired future is not new, and in the English tradition is vividly demonstrated in the future, inscribed in present oppression felt in the poems of Shelley. But closer to now, for a reader in the US, to read the selections from Souffles-Anfas is to be brought up sharply by work contemporary with the American Black Arts movement. To give you just a sense of where this starts, Doldrums by Abdelatif Laabi, pronunciation I don't know, forgive me, I'm being fearlessly English about this, has a hard edge that certainly equals Amiri Baraka's work. And Bloods by Mohammed Kaya Eddin is a startling piece of writing, and I can't resist giving you a small sample translated by Teresa. My scoundrel blood, my ordinary blood, my turgid winter blood, in which I learned to hide myself to better count the black ice and hail my sidewalk blood, my bastard blood, docile and devious, not a salon dog, not for the ladies with the copper-red smiles, the real smile of a helianthus, it's you proper blood that always skids towards the roots of disorder, my leper blood like Saint-Just on the scaffold, my blood you tremble, my blood you consecrate a real evildoer, my blood you gun down, my blood you have the eye of a terrorist, my blood, you fled from the protuberance on the bejeweled hand of the master, my blood in which clang chains and real palace bells. I'll just stop there. You get the idea. But this, written in, I guess, written in 1966, sounds more like a contemporary such as Keston Sutherland than anything else. While the poetry and essays and manifestos collected in Souffles-Anfas what they show is the vitality of political thought and artistic activity in the post-colonial Maghreb, and that, for instance, the Black Panthers setting up their international office in Algeria reflected not just an attempt to evade US legal retribution, but a connection with a vital center of intellectual energy and creativity. Preparing the Souffles-Anfas volume has taken almost a decade and has shaped Teresa Villa-Ignacio's thinking around what she follows Joan Retallack in calling poetics. She explains that for Retallack, the practices of poetics range from thinking about how we use language in order to understand events, to connecting an individual to a community or public ethos, to a form of living itself. Such a perspective is clearly at odds with the valuing and examination of a lyric poem as an object, whether exquisite or disturbing. Hence, the relationship between poetry and time becomes crucial. Poetry had always been a time-based medium before poems were fated to rest on a slide for scholarly scrutiny. But increasingly, poetic rhythm has escaped to encounter newer time-based media, film, for instance, as well as performance. This quarter, we've had an opportunity to experience multimedia poetics in the work of Caroline Bergvall and Jen Scapitoni, but I suspect today we might hear an implied critique of contemporaneity breaking down into disparate temporalities when viewed from a post-humanity projected lyrically. In the West, the privileged may be nostalgic for a present which cannot be touched and felt, while others, both in the West and elsewhere, may be mired in a slow present. Yet lyric poetry's corporeal enactment of futurity restores the connection between the thickly or thinly contingent and an imagined, not acclaimed and exploited, universality. Announcing this talk, Villa-Ignacio gestures towards, quote, a new post-human hybrid ecology and a post-humanity that, arriving after the human, exceeds, critiques, and resists it. It is bold to extrapolate from the little futurities of a minority art in this way, but consistent with the lyric leap from inspiration or souffle to aspiration. So we are to hear the talk, Aspirational Images and Post-Human Ethics, Cole Swenson, Suzanne Doppert, and Pierre Alferi.
Thank you so much, John, for that wonderful introduction and your incredible reading of Bloods, which makes me want to corral you into our reading tour that we're doing right now of the anthology, because I could never read it with that much passion. I would be too afraid to. So thank you for letting me hear that. And thank you all for being here, and thank you to the program in Poetry and Poetics. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. The aspirational images aren't in here because it was already taking up too much space, but you can imagine them aspiring behind the screen. They will appear shortly. The poets Cole Swenson, Suzanne Doppelt, and Pierre Alferi have collaborated extensively over the last 25 years on translations, poetry, photography hybrids, and literary journals. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Alferi and Doppelt co-edited an experimental arts journal, Détail, or Detail, which had deep investments in American experimental poetry and featured translations of Alferi, or by Alferi, of John Ashbery's Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror, and selections of Charles Olson's Maximus poems. They also collaborated on Cube Or, a book of poems by Alferi, featuring photographs by Doppelt and translated by Swenson as OXO. And OXO and Cube Or are both Bouillon Cube brands in their respective countries. So kind of an idea of condensing the present moment into very dense poetry is in the title. Alferi went on to co-edit with the poet Olivier Cadiot, La Revue de Littérature Générale, or the Review of General Literature, a journal that appeared, an enormous journal actually, that appeared in 2 volumes and also featured many American poets in translation, from T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound to Charles Bernstein and Stacey Doris. Swenson has translated many works of French and Francophone poetry, among them several works by Alferi and Doppelt each. And for the last several years, Swenson has also directed a small press dedicated to publishing translations of contemporary French poetry, aptly named La Presse. And this is a screenshot of their website with, I guess they have 10 books now. Those pictures are actually the covers of the books. All 3 poets consistently produce intermedial or transmedial poetry. Swenson's oeuvre delves frequently into the history of art. Doppelt has demonstrated a steadfast commitment to producing hybrid poetry photography books, and Alferi is well known as the innovator of the cinepoem genre. I contend that undertaking their respective intermedial and transmedial projects in the context of their translational and collaborative relationships has fostered in them an ethics of perception that transcends human subjectivity. That is, they invite their readers to imagine the perspectives of plants, animals, technological devices, and planet Earth itself, and create poetic spaces that facilitate collective communing in post-human environments. Today, I'd like to argue that their collective poetic and translational oeuvre resonates with emergent theories of the post-human and even offers some of its own practice-based theories of post-human ethics. However, before launching into a discussion of the concepts of the post-human and what they may mean for these poets, I'd first like to situate this talk within my broader approach to ethics and its appearance in contemporary and French-American poetry and relationships of their translation. Throughout my book manuscript, from which this talk is an excerpt, I work with the Levinasian framework to conceive of translation as an ethical relationship of hospitality. And in particular, I study the centrality of ethics in what I call translationships, or relationships of translation, collaboration, and poetic exchange in the French-American context from the 1960s to the present. So I investigate how we might understand poetic texts in the context of their translations and their authors as translators, as hosts or guests, especially when we consider translation to be a hospitable act of putting others' needs before one's own. In terms of translation, the other may be the source of the text, and one may be the source of the target language text, or the other may be the reader of the translated text, where the one is the translator, so that a Levinasian approach to translation might involve the deferring of the identitary unity of the target language through what Lawrence Venuti would call a foreignizing translation that reminds us that we're reading a translation. This approach is also instructive when transferred to the translator as writer, and since most of the translators I read are also poets, a Levinasian approach to writing might involve a deferring of the individual writer's ego in the service of a greater collective good. I would characterize Levinas as an anthropocentric thinker, so this chapter on post-human ethics, which I'm going to read from today, is perhaps the most explicitly post-Levinasian in that it explores the ethical possibilities of putting non-human needs before human needs in poetry. I should also say Levinas doesn't fully ignore animals, and some people have talked about that, and we can talk about that more if you're interested. I'm just kind of giving you some key terms right now. Another important distinction I make following Levinas is between the terms ethics and morality. While we usually use the term morality to designate a predetermined system of good and evil or right and wrong, ethics is the practice of making a decision in a context that exceeds the capacity of all existing moral codes. This distinction, you can also kind of hear it in our everyday use of the term. Sometimes you can, sometimes a lot of the time they're very confused or used synonymously. I mean, if you hear about a Senate ethics committee, for example, although who knows really what they're doing there, or the University Ethics Committee, right? We have a moral code of conduct. It's not called a moral code of conduct, but that's what's understood, right? So an ethics committee gets together when there's a new issue that comes up that we don't know how to deal with yet. It's not, our code of conduct doesn't have anything explicitly helping us with that issue yet. So back to post-human phenomena, right? Post-human phenomena are particularly ripe for Levinasian ethical inquiry because the post-human is a relatively new category that concerns many contexts and events that exceed our traditional moral codes. Post-humanity abounds with moments of ethical dilemma and seemingly impossible ethical decision. The way I'd like to think about post-humanism in the context of these three poet-translators related works is most inspired by Rosie Braidotti's vision as she lays it out in her 2013 book, The Post-Human. In Braidotti's view, the post-human is a perspective that affirms the interconnection of all life and all technology on planet Earth. Drawing on the anti-humanist, feminist, and post-colonial traditions, the post-human opens up the category of the human to the humans who have historically been excluded from it. And when we hear human, she means that we hear this Cartesian idea of the human, right? Someone who's white, European, an adult male, able-bodied, and rational, and the measure of all things is this image that you all know so well tells us, right? At the same time, in dialogue with animal studies, ecofeminism, I'm going to go back to the woman, and you can't really see, but you can see kind of technology and DNA, and it's a wonderful cover. So in dialogue with animal studies, ecofeminism, and science and technology studies, among many other disciplines, posthumanism acknowledges that the powerful and often destructive role that humans play in the nature, culture, technology continuum that we have collectively enabled, must be paid attention to, must continue to be at the center even as we keep moving forward, right? Seeking out new post-human interconnections and advocating for post-human ethics. Braidotti owes much to preceding theories of post-humanism as natural and technological egalitarianism, particularly by Donna Haraway and Catherine Hales. There are many other forms of post-humanism or thinking about post-humanism, and there may be many people in this room who might know more about those than I do, so please educate me later. I will just mention, there's a very biopolitical strain of thinking about post-humanism that's really great. Carrie Wolf, for example, thinking about egalitarianism toward animals in particular. There's an idea of transhumanism in which post-humanism is really about using technology to better human life and not necessarily thinking about any other entities. And then there's James Lovelock's idea of Gaia, and he thinks a lot about human extinction and post-human in the most literal sense. What happens after humans are gone, right? So I'm not going to go into those, but that doesn't mean that they're not somehow informing some of the things that are happening in this discussion. But the way I'd like to intervene in all of these discussions is by extending our thinking about about post-humanism and post-humanities to the arts and to poetry in particular. And there are already several approaches to thinking about the posthuman in poetry in terms of its content, especially animal studies, eco-poetics approaches. I think Juliana Spar is one of the best examples of this that we have today. And then also digital media studies approaches. And I just included, this is just from a blog called Visual Poetry. And just the fact that you can type into your search engine, Google, right, a question, and it already begins producing poetry for you. So it's, you know, poetry that is not created by humans, but is created by creations of humans. In the same way that posthumanisms or posthumanists have questioned the boundaries between humans and other planetary inhabitants and humans and technology, I'd like to think about art itself as another technological planetary entity with whom we as humans have established boundaries we are now in a position to question as we are questioning all other boundaries. What roles may works of art play in a posthuman world? How might they critique long-standing boundaries between nature, culture, and technology, and in so doing, make way for new connections among these domains? What kinds of persistent limits between humans and non-humans might these works of art reveal? And what ethical obligations do humans have toward works of art in a posthuman world? I began formulating these questions while reading Giorgio Agamben's essay Nymphs, which is related to our three poet translators through a tangential translationship. Suzanne Doppelt co-translated Nymphs into French as Nymph, which was published in 2004 in the book Images et Mémoires, écrit sur l'image, la danse et le cinéma. And it's available in English translation by Amanda Minervi. Well, in this standalone publication from Seagull Books, it first came out in a collection called Releasing the Image from Kant to New Media from Stanford. In Nymphs, Agamben locates a posthuman continuity between the human and non-human through a theorization of the dialectical image. The essay revolves around his analysis of the Nymph Panel from Abby Warburg's Mnemosyne Atlas, which includes 26 photographs of different works of art depicting nymphs. And I believe that this is the Nymph Panel. Okay, so there's, I think, maybe about 49 of these panels, and they're quite enormous, and they're really all of photographs. And I don't know what these are of, but maybe we can look at them more carefully, or maybe there is an Abby Warburg expert in here who can tell us later, I don't know. So Agamben notes in this work that it is impossible to determine which images existentially constitute original images of a nymph and which are copies. Comparing these images to the outsider Chicago artist Henry Darger's traces of photographs in his epic drawings, which similarly blur the original copy distinction, Agamben remarks that both Warburg and Darger want to give life to the spectral bodies that are the images of our memory. Reading Pericles' text on nymphs, Agamben argues that nymphs are images that desire the entity that desires them, that is, man, and nymphs only gain life and a soul in the encounter with a man. Thus, the image of a nymph always consists in the impossible vacillation between an ideal nymph and a real woman. Agamben analogizes this vacillation between nymph and woman with a vacillation between image and human. Now, you've noticed by now that Agamben's image that he's thinking about here is strikingly coded as feminine, which links the problem of the objectification of the image directly to the problem of the objectification of women and other less than human entities. He locates this vacillation between image and human in the imagination, and following the medieval philosopher Averroès, notes that imagination, which defines the human, lies at the threshold between the corporeal and the incorporeal, the individual and the collective, feeling and thought. In other words, the imagination is the limit event that defines the human species, and defines the human species is a quote from Agamben. He argues we must read Warburg's Atlas as a work of art focused on the limit between the individual and the collective that images and the imagination reveal. He theorizes that Warburg created his atlas as a guide through the collective human imagination in order to emphasize collective contributions to our collective imagination and to invite us to attend to their life, that is, the life of our collective history. Although the term posthuman does not appear in Nymphs, I contend that it theorizes the emergence of the posthuman as grounded in the relation between the human and the living images we create. Like the image of the nymph, whose existence consists of an ongoing vacillation between itself and that which it aspires to be, these poets' images aspire to be or to become that which they allow us to imagine, and in doing so, take on posthuman lives of their own. In particular, Swenson's ekphrastic images aspire to embody the symbiotic ecologies of human-constructed environments. Doppelt's hybrid poetry photography images aspire to encapsulate and disrupt our post-human cosmologies. And Alfieri's self-aware images, traversing the media of poetry, film, and his own medium, the cinepoem, aspire to mediate post-human consciousness. All the poem's speakers are cyborg speakers, blending the perspectives of the human eye, the photographic camera, the cinematic camera, other technologies, and sometimes other species' eyes. The poems unceasingly invite us to consider the non-human before the human, to move toward a post-anthropocentric perspective, and they encourage us to document our history through new technologies. Read together, these poetic oeuvres present a fascinating tension between, on the one hand, an optimistic post-humanism that envisions non-human and human entities as they have conventionally been understood, melting away into a post-human hybrid ecology, and on the other, a post-humanity that, arriving after the human, exceeds, critiques, and resists it, as John mentioned. So I'm going to turn now to Cole Swenson. Cole Swenson consistently interrogates modes of visibility. She thoroughly researches Western, European, and most often French art and visual culture from the Middle Ages to the present as source material for her poetry. Also running through several of her books is a fine attention to the ethical paradox that compels humans to order the world for our purposes while respecting its irreducible alterity when we're able to do the latter. She brings these intertwined questions of visual perception and ethics to poems on public gardens and parks, which she describes as hybrid microenvironments in which nature, culture, and technology combine to require a particularly post-anthropocentric, post-human ethical perspective. One of her earlier poems on this subject, entitled Park, was first partially published in translation by Alfieri in Détail 5, then published in English by Floating Island in 1991, and republished by Alfieri in French in its entirety for the Format Américain series, edited by Juliette Valéry in 1995. It consists of two main parts of 17 sections each, 4 short interludes, and a short parable. The verse part features 1 stanza per section, the prose part 1 paragraph per section. The poem presents multiple fragmented perspectives on an unidentified park that collectively mediate on the relationship between humans and the naturally and technologically mediated environments that we build for ourselves. Through this collective meditation, the park's own perspective on itself begins to emerge. In particular, the park, or at least this poetic image of the park, aspires to exceed the purposes for which we have built it. It breeds and yearns for a life of its own, an ecology of its own, separate from humans. The park thus both exemplifies the post-human symbiosis of the human and its environment, and the environment exceeding the humans that constructed it. The penultimate section of the park, also entitled Park, is a parable about several men who meet to design a park but cannot come to a consensus. Their argument resembles a competition to see who can come up with the most imaginative metaphor for park. For example, a park is a piece of sun stretched horizontally as far as it can be stretched and then left alone. A park is a photograph in a developing bath, climbing out of itself. A park is a face with a million pages. I would love to close read these, but I'm going to leave that to you for now. Meanwhile, the narrator notes, the sheets of plans began living their own lives, overgrowing and pollinating each other into intricate mixtures that resembled nothing previously proposed. So even here you can see things taking on a life of their own. Even inanimate objects are taking on the kind of growth of the park. In the end, they do not design a park, much less build one. I may not read all of this. It's really a lovely parable. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. You must read it. It's great. Anyway, the increasing indecision was becoming daily more inviting as now the plans lay too thick on every available inch of wall, and the architects spent their time wandering silently, musing as they visited various ones throughout the day. By the end of the 3rd month, they were spending most of their time gazing out the windows, so much so that the activity began improving their vision, and each of them discovered daily his or her horizons extending to display first the outskirts of the city, and then gradually farmlands, wilderness, and mountainsides, punctuated in the late evening by the glowing of animals. As they are saddled with the impossible goal of creating a perfect environment, one which should provide all the senses with an experience of perfect harmony, it's no wonder that the architects prefer to prolong their fantasies rather than make a decision. Yet it's also possible to read their fate of gazing out of the windows and seeing farther and more clearly as a post-human ethical event. Their attempt to create an enclosed natural space results in the surrender to the actual natural spaces and natural entities, such as animals, that already exist outside their enclosure, and their enclosure, which is their meeting room. The impossible decision also makes possible a broader, deeper vision that puts the very existence of the park into question, that is, puts into question the human need to enclose nature. The etymological history of the word park suggests that it derives from the word for fence, which was the word fence that was used to create the enclosure itself. So the park, as an enclosure, has traditionally been set off from the rest of the city or whatever lived area for recreation, and therefore set off from work, politics, worship, all the activities that separate humans from our environment, with the intention that we may commune more fully with nature. Yet, as an enclosure, the park cannot but always remind us that we have already set ourselves off from nature. Swenson suggests that, rather than leading to conflict, the architect's impossible decision alternately makes observation amply probable. Such observation entails an ethics of perception that shifts emphasis away from imposing yet another anthropocentric structure on the planet and toward the already existing ecology. A more recent book of Swenson's, entitled Hours, from 2008, meditates extensively on the gardens of André Le Nôtre, the 17th century gardener who designed the gardens of Louis XIV, Louis XIV, including Versailles and the Tuileries, as well as those belonging to many members of the French aristocracy. The historical personages that populate Hours are engaged in shaping nature to meet their needs, that is, making it hospitable to themselves. Catherine de Médicis, who designed the Tuileries in the century preceding Le Nôtre's redesign, quote, was a pacer and required miles and miles of overhanging trees, unquote. Thus, the grandiose architectural landscaping of the Tuileries was tailored to house her imagination. Louis XIV, according to Swenson, I quote, inaugurated a malleable earth, a thing that could be turned over in the hand and made perfect, given time and unlimited weather. It was an age that felt that nature could be corrected. I think this is Versailles, and this is the Château de Vaux, Le Vicomte. The poem concisely describes the hubris of the age, which posits human mathematical and moral superiority over nature, as you can see, and at once admires its ambition and parodies the Sun King's absolutism with curt monosyllabic commands. Quote, more read, less said, no flies, end quote. It portrays Le Nôtre's contemporaries, the equivalent of today's world leaders, in their efforts to tame both nature and nature with a capital N and human nature. These individuals seek, in the order and control of nature, capital N, the opportunity to order and control their inner natures. They seek both to make nature a hospitable place and to make themselves hospitable to nature. Although the garden has long been a symbol of human mastery over nature, Ours shows how the natural environment has mastered the human. The poem elaborates what I characterize as a post-human ekphrasis in order to show how the gardens critique the boundaries between humans, nature, and art. Swenson herself articulated the poem's sense of expanded ekphrasis in a lecture she gave on this work in 2005, while it was still in progress, noting that Ours challenges the boundaries between art and life by allowing for the expansion of the ekphrastic experience to encompass all the senses and all natural elements. Moreover, the ekphrasis of the garden expands the ekphrastic agent's stance, no longer opposing or facing a work of art in order to comment or respond to it. The ekphrastic agent enters the work of art and becomes a part of it. And I think a lot of recent, or not even so recent, feminist work on ekphrasis also echoes this view. I'll quote Swenson now. The first public gardens in history were called oubliettes, which means things you've forgotten or places you go to forget, or something like that. As soon as you entered, you were indistinguishable from the animals. End quote. While an anthropocentric framework from these verses might appear to offer a light mockery of the humans who might have forgotten their human behaviors and succumbed to acting like animals, within a post-human framework, they remind us that humans are indeed a species of animal, and the distinction between the two is artificial at best. Ours shifts constantly between 17th century and 21st century perspectives on Le Nôtre's gardens, which underscores the historical shift from their private ownership by the most elite members of French society to their public ownership by the French people and accessibility to anyone in the world that can make their way to France. As Swenson writes, the perfect lines, curves, and perspectives that Le Nôtre espoused belie the inevitability of change over time. I quote, André Le Nôtre thought that by gardening along the strictest principles of geometry, time would come apart in his hands. There goes private property. end quote. The garden's aesthetic of timelessness has ironically come to represent a particular moment in aesthetic history. Similarly, just as it seemed at the time that these gardens would belong forever to their private owners, that perspective has also become a historical one and has been replaced by public ownership and virtually universal accessibility. Ours, a penultimate poem, entitled Tuileries, January 2007, depicts the democratization of the gardens. I'll read, and to the mystery of private property, add 5 centuries who in time added time to the list, a heavy distance in a tiny enemy of many. Now they leave the Tuileries open in winter until 7 p.m. It's long past dark, and there are people scattered all through it, walking silent and alone and at home. The garden has been seamlessly absorbed into the urban environment that surrounds it, and its human inhabitants resemble Michel de Certeau's walker in the city, who creates the city through the elaboration of his unique paths through it. Ours recognizes that the democratization of the gardens has extended to the gardens themselves, and reveals that Le Nôtre's gardens have become a historical subject, like any person or community. The post-human relation to the environment is one that has moved beyond the imperative of mastery to accept the invitation of collective, reciprocal interrelation and connectivity. Just as humans have had a role in the garden's evolution, the gardens have had a role in human evolution. By giving the book-length poem the title Ours, heeding the wonderful synchronicity of Le Nôtre's name, which of course means ours in French, Swenson not only underscores the democratized fate of his gardens, but also makes available an even greater sense of collectivity. These gardens are ours. They belong to all of us living in the 21st century, but the gardens may also claim humans and its many other inhabitants as their own. We think of the gardens as ours. If they could speak, they might say the same thing about us. Suzanne Dopelt's hybrid poetry photography books display an obsession with cosmologies, systems that seek to bring order to the universe. They simultaneously embrace a totalizing impulse to catalog everything in the world and resist that impulse by exceeding their frames. However, whereas humans have traditionally developed cosmologies in order to understand the universe through recognizable, often hierarchical categories, Dopelt's cosmologies at once draw on those traditional cosmologies while exploding them in favor of post-human perspectives that celebrate the egalitarian interconnectedness of all natural, cultural, and technological entities. At the same time, they constantly step back from their visions of post-human utopia to problematize human singularity. Cole Swenson has translated 3 of Dopelt's works, all published in the 2000s in French. I'll examine excerpts from each in turn to see how Dopelt develops post-human cosmologies for our reading and viewing pleasure and displeasure. Quelque chose cloche was published in 2004 and appeared in 2006 in English from Burning Deck under Swenson's delightful translation of the title, Ring Rang Wrong. The poem insists on the interconnectedness of all things in nature. However, it carefully frames its presentation of this interconnectedness through a highly disciplined structure featuring formulaic sections and juxtapositions of photos and texts at regular intervals, which highlight the contingency of its framing devices and the fact that it is presenting content created by a human for other humans. It is a conversational prose poem full of aphorisms, tongue-in-cheek jibes, and anecdotes that also turn the universality of its cosmological aspirations upside down. In each section, the photographs and text appear to interrupt each other, and the connections between them, if any, are rarely clear. And the book testifies to the fact that in our historical moment, the visual has overtaken the verbal, and to the realization that we can't consistently rely on either to corroborate the other. The poem celebrates order and disorder at one and the same time. The most beautiful order, the order of the world, is like a pile of refuse scattered pell-mell. Thus, its celebrations of post-human cosmological interconnectivity may immediately be followed with anecdotes of disruption, as in this post-human interpretation of meteorology, which you may not be able to read. I will read it in English. Flies bite more before a storm. The climate makes the man. This is a book. Dr. Mills affirms that persistent winds influence human behavior. It was precisely during a great wind from the east, the doctor told Voltaire, that Charles I was beheaded and Jacques II dethroned. Perhaps these political deposings are part of the greater cosmological order, perhaps they are coincidences. Alternations among serious assertions and light and dark strains of humor run through the text, as in these articulations of the connectedness of plants, animals, and humans in life and death. The vegetal is an animal by correspondence, peony, woodpecker, thistle, falcon, etc., or by contiguity, outside where it rhizomes with an animal. Man himself sprouted from the ground like spinach. And Heraclitus, who ate nothing but hemlock and grasses, proved it. Plants cause death. The overall sense that these alternating tones evokes is one of balance between joy and horror. And there's a great article in the recent PMLA on emotions. It's called Post-Human Compassions. It's by Elizabeth Arnoux Bloomfield, and she evokes these different posthumanisms, one by Derrida, where he's talking about this cat and his sharing of the experience of finitude with his cat, and then the other from Donna Haraway, where she's talking about the joy of being with the dog. So, and Arnoux Bloomfield says we need both. And I think Doppelt is kind of making a similar kind of balance possible in this poem. However, despite the affective balance of the text, the overall effect of this poetry-photography hybrid is one of movement toward greater and more frequent disruption. This set of photos offers much mystery to their beholder. I don't really know what they are. There's a lot of her photos, you don't really know what they are. I mean, you can imagine, you can ask her, she may not remember. So I ask, have they captured lighting striking a misty mountaintop? Have they captured lightning striking the same place twice? Or a bomb, or two bombs? So, is the light coming down, right? Or do they depict one or two missiles or flares launching? Or light piercing through an aperture in two different directions? And what to make of the small band of texture running between them, a design, an overwriting of language. The composite image appears in the midst of an anecdote about the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, who we now know as our self-poisoner. One fine day, Heraclitus, fed up, withdraws, eats nothing but plants and herbs, which gives him dropsy, which is in case you haven't been around for a while, is a translation of hydropique, which today we would call edema or swelling. It often accompanies congestive heart failure and death. Okay, or at least it's a symptom of the fact that you're going to die soon. Back to the poem. He asks the doctor how to turn rain into drought. He doesn't get it. Question, riddle, warning. He lies down in the sun covered with manure and dies the next day. The text goes on to describe a storm and flood, the opposite of what Heraclitus had hoped for. The cumulative effect of these elements of disruption in the poem is to compel us to look beyond, or at least compel us to wish to see beyond the supposedly human-friendly frames of prose text and carefully curated photography that the book presents. The phrase quelque chose cloche idiomatically signals that something is off, something isn't quite right, and Swenson's translation, ring, rang, wrong, captures that sense imaginatively. The sense that something is not quite right has to do with our longing to know what lies beyond the frame of the photograph, beyond the hints of anecdote and aphorism that the text offers. We realize that a cosmology can only fail to tell us a whole story, and we end the book with a surprisingly unsatisfied feeling, always wanting to know more. Doppelt's Le Pré est vénéneux, published in 2007, was translated by Swenson as The Field is Lethal and published by Counterpath in 2011. The translation of the title draws our attention to the fields of the page of poetry and the photograph, both of which are even more disciplined than those in Quelque chose cloche. The text alternates between a first en face presentation of a blank page on the left, actually it's this, and a page full of prose text on the right, and a second en face presentation of a blank page on the left, a page full of photos on the right, and a band of words running along the bottom of both pages. The texts are formally equivalent to the photos, solid, uniform rectangles of prose. In content, they share the photos' alternately spontaneous and composed quality, offering brief vignettes for our contemplation. Yet the texts unleash a great vitality, energetic flourishes that persuade us that everything in the world is in motion, constantly in flux, and it's all very exciting. We must embrace it all, even the most frightening parts, of which the book's title reminds us. This textual exuberance leads us to detect the same vitality in the photos, to lavish attention on their details. Many of the photos appear to be extreme close-up shots. Many appear to be prints of longer exposures in which the object in the photograph was moved, so that the objects and even the photographs themselves appear to be vibrating. I'm not sure if you can tell with this one, but this one is very still. This one looks more like it had been moved while it was being captured. These minute details they make available appear in stark contrast to the cosmological aspirations that the texts offer. Finally, the page's ubiquitously generous blank spaces invite reflections on the photos in a text inhabiting the blank spaces of the page, just as the various fields they depict are inhabited by all manner of entities and characters. The book's tensions between stillness, stability, uniformity on the one hand, and movement, vitality, and variation on the other foreground the very foundational problematic of photography, and truly that of all the visual arts, how to capture a world in motion in a still medium. To give you a sense of the book's ecstasies of eco-techno-anthropological harmony, I will cite a few examples. Here is an example of a rhythmic poetizing of biotransformations across the natural continuum. The smallest point becomes a worm, the unknown worm becomes a butterfly, a flower blooms and then soon wilts, an acorn becomes an oak. An example of a human singing as a superior telecommunications system. I'm not going to do the singing part. I send messages directly, with or without words, between Washington and Baltimore, Rome and Naples. I am stronger than the mail or telecommunications. And an example of a description of experiential plant phenomena that resemble those of humans. Note that it is not an anthropomorphization of plants. Plants have appetites, feel sensations, drunkenness, bitterness, etc. Some of them sleep at night, daisies, for instance. And my favorite page of the text begins with minute rumblings that evolve into an earthquake and then into the apocalypse, yet throughout the whole episode, the whole planet still appears to be moving together in perfect harmony. So our post-human ethical obligations become visible through the book's photography and phototext juxtapositions. In this first phototext juxtaposition of the book, we discover photographs, or one photograph, of two unusual shapes that resemble unfolding flowers, but perhaps also origami versions of flowers that have been flattened. The accompanying text self-references its placement at the bottom of the screen of the two open pages, and in some ways takes on the role of a subtitle, though perhaps not an entirely correspondent one. Toward the bottom of the screen, flower blooming in the morning. Soon it fades, and the contents of a memory projected. It's a target image. The world in which she lives is two pieces. The text confuses us as to which flower is the target image and arouses our curiosity about her and what the two pieces of her life might be. Is it life itself and photography of it? Is it life itself and the memory of it? The second phototext juxtaposes features on the left that, a composition of technological elements that can be easily anthropomorphized, and on the right, perhaps, it's hard to see here, but perhaps the moment of a dandelion seeds blowing away in the breeze. Its accompanying text reads, "What glistens sees, things watching us." In French, it's "Ce qui brille voit, les choses nous regardent," which recalls the lines of Baudelaire's sonnet Correspondance, "L'homme y passe à travers des forêts de symboles, qu'il observe avec des regards familiers." So men walk through a forest of symbols that observe them with familiar gazes. You hear this when you read that in the French, because throughout the whole text, d'Opelt has been paraphrasing another line from Correspondance, "Les parfums, les couleurs et les sons se répondent," perfumes, colors, and sounds correspond, as les formes et les couleurs se répondent, or forms and colors correspond. And then the third phototext features multiple indeterminate photos, perhaps of a sky, and multiple exposures of a tree, recalling in at once an awkward and elegant way the perpetual motion of nature. Viewed together, all these phototexts remind us that when we take photographs of nature, we are not just capturing images of nature for our own viewing pleasure. In doing so, we are relating to natural entities in a new way. We must ask ourselves, how do we relate to their motility from a fixed vantage point? We can't. We must realize that we too are always moving, always in motion. The text subtly and not so subtly exhorts us to break free of our stillness and move around like the rest of our environment. So Lazy Susie, published in 2009 and an English translation with the same title in 2014 by Litmus Press, begins with the presumption that everything is connectable because it is visible to the human eye, and analogizes all cameras to the human eye and the human eye to all cameras, and analogizes all rotating spherical things to the human eye, and so forth, so that suddenly all is visible in all its marvelousness. The text consists of prose poems of a few pages length, separated by photographs, though the text can also be read as one long narrative. Always accelerating in rhythm and pace, we easily succumb to the whirlwind of every round thing in its rotating. However, while many the text and many of the photos represent things that are round, the shape of the photos and the texts remains decidedly rectangular. We recognize a blatant pattern from Dopelt's earlier books, and as if she knows that we have recognized it, she titles the book with a self-mocking wordplay. Once again, Lazy Susie goes round and round in circles, but stays in the same rectangular place while we become dizzy. Yet the book seems, more than any other, fully reconciled to this tension, comfortable in the discomfort of its contradictions, as if to insist that the only way we can perceive the fragmented, multiplicitous post-human worldview of natural and technological perspectives converging is through these translations into the very human forms of the poem and the photograph. Dopelt's fantastical descriptions of the human eye at work place it at the center of post-human perception and self-perception. For the eye is not an independent machine. It works in tandem with light, placement, movement, and of course language, connecting it to these things and analogizing it to other natural objects and technological devices. She reveals that it is through the invention of seeing technologies that we have come to understand our own seeing better. She describes the eye as a camera technology, rather than the camera as an eye technology. I quote, "The eye is a dark room with a lens on one side and a screen on the other. All you need is some good sun and a tiny hole in the size of a pin in order to draw an exact image of the world on the opposite wall, inverted but intact, a singular landscape well lit, the colors, the shadows, the clouds, the ripples on the water, the flight of birds, all seen under a nicely brilliant sun." Most creatively and centrally for this book, she characterizes the eye as a super rotary Lazy Susan, one among many others rotating in this book, rotating devices in this book. It's the rond de Dupont, an old-fashioned three-legged table stamps its foot and rises a whole 6 inches off the ground. Can you keep your lines coming from the table in its current position? Just lay your hands upon it, a real bit of legerdemain, and matter changes, the eye swivels. It's what gathers up the spheres as the ear does sounds, and the illusions they cause, furniture adrift. Aerial, it glides in a circle, endlessly turning with its super rotary Lazy Susan all around the earth, itself resembling a table or an egg. It's borrowed light. She also points out that these are all illusions, right? Reality is just a matter of fine-tuning, right? But there's a photograph of a camera lens that looks and acts like a human eye, mirroring the image behind it upside down. So in the course of his career, Pierre Alféry has developed a similarly compelling obsession with the eye of the camera, both in his written poetry and his cinepoetry. However, I would first and foremost characterize him as a poet who's concerned with poetry as movement. The first hints of his interest in post-human interconnectedness were not primarily concerned with language or with visuality in or next to poetry, but rather with producing that movement through literary language. He outlines these concerns in his theoretical manifesto, Cherchez une phrase, which appeared in 1991 and was partially translated as To Seek a Sentence by Anna Moshavakis in Verse magazine. Alféry refreshes our literary theory lexicon, redefining the terms through which we think about literature, about the relationships between the world, things, and experiences. Like his elders, the post-structuralists, he agrees that language can never be one with its referent. However, he does not agree with them with the theory of the unsayable. Reference and the sayable or unsayable give way to Alféry's theory of literary singularity, which he locates in rhythm and syntax. He argues that each work of literature places words in a unique manner, and that by placing them in any other way, they would cease to be literature. He makes analogies to music, right? If you put notes in any other way, they would not be that piece of music that they are, and they might not even be music at all. And we could also say that about paraphrase, right? If we paraphrase a work of literature, it's not going to be literature anymore, unless it's a really, really creative paraphrase, right? He also says that the work of literature is not simply to make up sentences, but to invent sentences. And I have a quote here that I think is very helpful in terms of the way that he's thinking differently about the unsayable, which I'll read in English. The sole task of literature is to invent new syntactic forms, new forms of rhythm, to extend language. Saying in this sense no longer leaves any place for the phantom of the unsayable. Like the horizon, the unsayable recoils with each sentence. The only obstacle occurs each time a set of worn-out sentences shields itself from its own cutting edge. Every phrase must overcome its own obstacle, but none of them are impassable. That was my translation, so apologies if it's not so great. For him, there is no separation between words and things, because words are things, though things are not necessarily words. His post-human theory of literature therefore seeks to reconnect human language to the world in which it exists. And so he goes on to write some poetry. In fact, he wrote a poem called Natural Gaits, or Les Allures Naturelles, at the same time, that was trying to capture movement in language. And then he wrote this other book the next year where he kind of looks at experiments done on animals and how humans are kind of living out those experiments themselves. Very interesting. But I'm going to just show you this cinepoem, and we can talk a little bit about what he's doing. This is maybe about 10 years after he wrote Chercher une phrase. So how he's kind of moving, still kind of working on the same thing, but also moving beyond it. Feel like you have an idea of what's going on. I gotta stop it. It's only about 3 minutes long, but I feel like it's not fair for anyone who's not a French speaker here. So I can just translate. So the two sentences, or the two kinds of sentences kind of appearing on the top here, are they're addressed to, or they're a second person address. So tu coupes l'herbe sous les pieds, so you cut the grass under your feet or under someone's feet. Tu ranimes, you come back to life. Underneath is well, it's a first person saying, I'm going to do something to you. So je vais te démantibuler. I honestly don't know what that's. Anyone have any? I mean, it sounds terrible. Probably I'm going to rip your jaw apart. Probably they're actually very violent, a lot of them. But let's just keep going. Okay, I'm going to put you in a black box. You're gonna spread some false news. You're gonna bring yourself back together. I'm going to demultiply you, whatever that means. You're gonna make the night come. You're gonna forget yourself. You're going to dilapidate yourself, and that's the end. Oh, and we were almost done. Okay, so just so you know, so it's a lot of you are this, you're that, you're going to do that, or you're doing this, you're doing that, with kind of subtext of I'm going to do these things to you. I'm going to do these. I'm going to bend you. Right? I'm going to profane you. I'm going to unlock you. So I should also mention this cinepoem is called Elvin Jones, after the jazz drummer, although that was not his percussion in the background. So I read this cinepoem as a natural progression of Alféri's work on movement, since it literally sets words in motion and sets sentences in motion. It describes second-person experiences in the present and future, in particular, things you're going to do in the present, things someone else is going to do to you in the near future, as it's in the futur proche, right? It allows the viewer to identify with the you and to construct a narrative, but also defamiliarizes that narrative narrative, especially with its upbeat techno percussion soundtrack, and allows for disidentification with it. It resembles another cinepoem Alféry made called Ne l'oublie pas, or Don't Forget, which is a little bit longer and a little bit more complex. It's maybe about 10 minutes long. In both cinepoems, each line changes quickly. They all change at different speeds, fading in and out. Most of the time, the changes happen too quickly for any spectator to be able to read and absorb all of them. So they describe things you did, epiphanic moments, cliché moments of epiphany, violent things that may happen to you. Although the command is not to forget things that happened or will happen to you, they're all going by so quickly that of course you're going to forget them all, until finally the lines fade one by one and then all together, just as your memory of them will. The experience of watching these sentences as part of a group suggests that as a collective we all have the same elements of experience available to us. And even though the film demands that we not forget, perhaps their interchangeability suggests the impossibility of the singularity of experience and leads us to question whether singularity is more valuable than commonality. So in conclusion, I'd like to return to the question of the significance of the Swensen-Doppelt-Alféry translationships in the context of French-American Poetic Exchange, more generally. For although their works may be addressing questions of planetary post-human poetics, they are still addressing those questions in national languages and in the context of national and international intellectual communities and publishing markets. Swensen's role as a poetic historian of French cultural, political, environmental history is evident in the works I've discussed here, and I believe it's clearly appealing to French and Francophone readers who discover her in translation. However, aside from their generally inventive qualities, it's not clear why Doppelt and Alféry would be of interest to American readers. Although one thing that I will talk about more in my book is the way in which Ashbery has very much influenced Alféry, and if you read his poetry, for years and years later, there are a lot of echoes and resonances with Ashbery, in my view. Well, I think that Cole Swensen translates them into English, as is probably obvious by now, both Doppelt and Alféry, because her work has many affinities with theirs, though she would tell you that her work is quite different from everyone she translates, which is why she translates them. So I'd like to evoke Pierre Bourdieu's theory of the two empires of the universal, basically French and American culture. And he argues that both cultures see themselves as the universal. They see themselves as at the center of the world. The cultures that everyone wants to come to, the cultures that everyone moves away from. Okay, so I would say that Doppelt and Alféry are important for the American poetry reading public because they reject this idea of French and American, they're not really concerned about American universalism, but they're definitely rejecting the idea of French universalism. They do enjoy French history and literary traditions, and they invoke them in their work, but always as artifacts of a particular rather than a universal culture. So another important role of the work of art in the age of posthumanism may be to critique humanist and neo-humanist universalism and invent new languages of specificity and commonality. Thank you.